If you've been with me since the beginning of this channel, you've almost certainly seen the chart I used for the title page. A modified version of it is actually the logo of this channel, and that's not an accident. It's that central, it's that important, because what it depicts is the proper timeline and the actual, correct interpretation of the 70 weeks prophecy, the one given by the angel Gabriel in the book of Daniel. I want to show you another chart. You are here, right now, at the precise moment this chart has been pointing to since I released the video 4 years ago. I need to say that again because it needs to land properly. This chart, this interpretation, has had a specific date sitting in it since I first constructed it in 2005. February 27th, 2026. It's in my research notes from that year, it's in my published book from 2016, and it's stated clearly in a video on this channel from 4 years ago, with a timestamp that anyone can verify. In Jewish reckoning, the day begins at sundown. The evening of February 27th, 2026, is the start of February 28th, and on that date, the United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated military strike on Iran, hitting their leadership, their nuclear facilities, their military infrastructure, an operation that is still going on as I record this. The date that was calculated from a 2,500-year-old prophecy, using Hebrew grammar, Babylonian imperial history, NASA Eclipse tables, and the life cycle of winter barley in Jerusalem, was exactly, precisely to the day correct. That's a bold claim, and I'm aware of what it sounds like. So let me show you every single step of how I got there, because this interpretation doesn't ask you to trust me, it asks you to follow the evidence. And the evidence has been sitting in plain sight for a very long time, waiting for exactly this moment. Now, what does this interpretation of the 70 weeks prophecy have going for it that no other interpretation does? First, it takes into account Jewish culture and the actual Hebrew language being used. Second, it incorporates real, verifiable historical dates for every prophetic event mentioned. And third, it takes the time periods literally. There's no special prophetic years, no 360-day years, no creative accounting, just the numbers as written. Let me walk you through it, step by step. Step 1. The starting year, 587 BC. Let's begin at the beginning. The 70 weeks prophecy starts in the year 587 BC. Right away, that's different from every other proposed interpretation I've ever encountered. Every single one. And the reason most people land somewhere else is that they don't really engage with the whole of Daniel chapter 9. They zoom in on the actual prophetic words, which appear in just a handful of verses near the end of the chapter, and they lift those verses out of context they belong in. But how do we know 587 is the right starting point? We don't have to guess. Gabriel tells us. He gives Daniel a very specific landmark to look for. At the opening of the prophecy, Gabriel uses a particular two-word phrase, twice. Restore and rebuild. In Hebrew, shub and banah. And here's the thing, Daniel would have immediately recognized those words. Why? Because right at the start of the chapter, Daniel tells us exactly what he had been doing. He had been studying Jeremiah's prophecy intensely, and he had just arrived at a stunning realization. What was this realization? He understood that the period that we see, or that would see the end of Jerusalem's desolation, was a span of 70 years. Now, I want to pause on that, because this is where modern interpretation almost universally goes wrong. People read 70 years and assume it refers to the exile, 70 years of the Jewish people living in captivity in Babylon. Or they think it means Jerusalem would sit in ruins for 70 years. But that's not what the text says. Let me read it to you directly. For thus says Yahweh, when 70 years have been fulfilled for Babylon, I will visit you and establish my good word to you, to return you to this place. And that's Jeremiah 29:10. The 70 years is tied specifically to the empire of Babylon itself. Not the exile, not the ruins, the empire. It would last 70 years and no longer. This is the foundational misunderstanding that causes almost everyone to start looking in the wrong place, searching for a decree from a Persian king that authorized the Jews to return and rebuild Jerusalem. But that's not where Gabriel is pointing. Here's the history. The Babylonian Empire lasted from 609 BC to 539 BC, exactly 70 years. It began when the Babylonians decisively defeated the Assyrians at Haran in 609 BC, and it ended when the Medes and Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BC. Now, picture Daniel. It's 538 BC. It's 1 year after that conquest. He's reading Jeremiah and it hits him. The 70 years of Babylon just ended, which means God's promise is now in play. And that's what drives his prayer. That anguished, passionate prayer in the middle of the chapter isn't just background noise. It's the engine of everything. He's not praying in general. He's praying because he just realized the clock has run out on Babylon, and he's asking God to act. So, when Gabriel arrives and uses the words Shub and Binah, restore and rebuild, Daniel knows exactly what that phrase is pointing to. He just read it, because Gabriel isn't referencing a king's decree at all. Here's the key linguistic point. The Hebrew word Gabriel uses for decree, or word, it's never used in the Old Testament of an earthly king's edict. Not once. It is always used of the word that proceeds from God. So Daniel goes searching, and he finds it in the very prophecies he'd been studying. I will return the fortunes of Judah and the fortunes of Israel and rebuild them as they were at first. Jeremiah 33, verse 7. There it is. The exact same phrase, Shub Binah, God himself prophesying that he would one day restore and rebuild Israel. And when was that prophecy made? Daniel finds that too, just one chapter earlier. The word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh in the 10th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. That's Jeremiah 32, verse 1. So the 10th year of Zedekiah, the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, 1 year before the destruction of Jerusalem, and that year was 587 BC. That's the starting line. That's where the first period of weeks in the 70 weeks prophecy begins. Step 2. The first 7 weeks ending at 538 BC. So, we've established that the prophecy begins in 587 BC. Now, the first period Gabriel mentions is 7 weeks of years. That's 49 years. And 587 BC plus 49 years brings us to 538 BC. Clean, simple, historically verifiable. And this is very clearly stated in Daniel 9:25. Now, your translation might not show that though. And that right there is a significant problem. So let me explain. Here's the verse from the Legacy Standard Bible. So you are to know and have insight that from the going out of a word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be restored and rebuilt with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Now, compare this to the same verse in the English Standard Version. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. And for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. Did you catch the difference? In a lot of translations, the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks get mushed together, and the reader naturally assumes Gabriel is describing one continuous block of 69 weeks. But the ESV renders them as 2 distinct, separate statements. This discrepancy is actually what started everything for me. Over 20 years ago, I stumbled across this difference between the translations, and it sent me down a rabbit hole I never came back out of. It's also, frankly, one of the main reasons this interpretation doesn't get taken seriously by a lot of people, because it runs against the King James Version, for example. And for a certain segment of Bible-believing Christians, that's simply a wall you cannot get past. No matter how clear the evidence, no matter how obvious the facts, the King James Version said it, and that settles it. But rather than getting pulled into an emotional battle between translations, let's do what we should always do. Go back to the original Hebrew that both translations are working from. We've already seen the phrase Shub and Bana appear twice in the prophecy. That repetition already hinted that we might be dealing with 2 distinct and separate periods of time. But here's the grammatical confirmation. In Hebrew, separation of thought is signaled by the word and. The language has no capitalization, no punctuation, so the conjunctions carry a lot of weight. And here's the thing. In the King James and similar translations, the translators inserted and between the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks, which forces the reader to group them together as a single unit. But in the Hebrew, there is no and between those 2 numbers. They stand apart. They are grammatically required to be read as 2 distinct and separate time periods. So what does that mean for the prophecy itself? Gabriel is telling Daniel that at the end of the first 7 weeks, at the 49-year mark, an anointed one, a prince, will come on the scene. Now, almost everyone's first instinct is to assume that anointed one or Messiah must be referring to Christ Jesus. And that's an understandable instinct, since most translations capitalize the word Messiah. Remember, though, Hebrew doesn't use capital letters. But here's something that most people don't realize. The Bible speaks of another anointed one in the Old Testament. And this is really the secret that unlocks the whole interpretation. The anointed one being referred to here is Cyrus, King Cyrus of Persia. Look at what Isaiah records directly from God. Thus says Yahweh to Cyrus his anointed, whom I have taken hold of by his right hand. Isaiah 45 verse 1. And just one chapter earlier, it is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and all my good pleasure he will complete. And saying of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid. It's Isaiah 44 verse 28. God himself calls Cyrus his anointed, his Messiah. And what did Cyrus do? He permitted the Jewish people to return to their homeland and begin the rebuilding process. The completion would take many more years, but the authorization, the return, the beginning, that was Cyrus. And Cyrus came to power in 538 BC, the exact year that ends the first 7 weeks of the prophecy. But I want to stop and let that sink in for a moment, because there's something deeply moving here that gets completely overlooked in other interpretations. Daniel was an old man in 538 BC. He had prayed that anguished, desperate prayer asking God to act on his promises. And within that same year, he got to see the answer. He watched Cyrus fulfill exactly what Gabriel had told him would happen at the end of the first 7 weeks. Now contrast that with the popular interpretation, the one that places the starting decree with Artaxerxes and Nehemiah. That event happened 100 years later. Daniel was long dead, which means under that reading, God delivered his answer to Daniel's prayer to a man who would never live to see it. The promise goes unfulfilled within Daniel's lifetime, within his generation, with even the next several generations. And that's not how God works. That's not what the text actually says, if you let the Hebrew speak for itself. Step number 3. The gap in 440 BC. Now here's where something unexpected enters the picture. A gap. And I can already hear the objection. A gap? Isn't that the kind of thing prophecy teachers invent when the numbers don't work out? Isn't that just a convenient escape hatch? That's a fair question, but stay with me. Because this gap isn't invented to save a failing interpretation. It's demanded by the historical record itself. And once you see it, it actually adds another layer of confirmation to everything we've been establishing here. Here's where we are. Gabriel has told Daniel that after the first 7 weeks, after Cyrus, there will be another period of 62 weeks of years. That's 434 years. And during this period, the city of Jerusalem will be restored and rebuilt. Then, after that, a second anointed one, a second Messiah, will be cut off, killed. So let's do the math. 538 BC plus 434 years puts us at 104 BC. Now, we have this advantage of hindsight. We can look at 104 BC and ask, was anything happening prophetically at this time that fits this description? Was there an anointed one who was killed? Was there a major fulfillment of this prophecy anywhere near this date? No, there wasn't. Nothing remotely even close. So, the 62 weeks cannot begin immediately at the end of the first 7 weeks. There has to be a gap between them. The question is, how long? And what determines it? The answer is sitting right there in Ezra and Nehemiah. Because when Cyrus allowed the Jews to return in 538 BC, the city was not rebuilt. Not really. The people went back, the temple foundation was eventually laid, but Jerusalem as a functioning walled city with infrastructure, with gates, with actual habitation, that didn't happen right away. In fact, by the time of Nehemiah, the situation was still dire. The remnant there in the province who remained from the captivity are in great calamity and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. And this you find in Nehemiah 1 verse 3. That's the report Nehemiah received. Broken walls, burned gates. This is still the condition of Jerusalem, and it's the decree of Artaxerxes in 444 BC that finally sets the rebuilding in motion. But here, and we need to slow down and think carefully, because 444 BC is not the actual year the walls were completed. Most people just assume Nehemiah arrived, built the walls, and that was that. All in the same year. But let's think through the logistics. Nehemiah records that the walls took 52 days to complete, and that the completion date was at the end of September. Count back 52 days, and his arrival in Jerusalem was around the beginning of August. He could only leave Persia at the very earliest at the end of April, after receiving the letters with the decree, organizing everything, getting the settlers together, departing. Could he possibly do all that within a month? Now add the journey. We know from Ezra that the trip from Babylon to Jerusalem took 4 months, and that was considered making very good time. But Nehemiah wasn't even in Babylon. He was at the royal palace in Susa, a further 250 miles to the east. And he wasn't just traveling. He had to assemble a group of settlers. He had to collect letters from the king to the various governors along the route, ordering that the raw materials be mined, cut, and delivered to Jerusalem for a massive construction project. Timber, stone, logistics on a significant scale. There is simply no way that this happened within a single calendar year. The timeline doesn't fit, no matter how you arrange it. And we're not left to reason this out alone. We have third-party confirmation from the historian Josephus, who records that Nehemiah actually came to Jerusalem in the 25th year of the reign of Xerxes, which places his arrival 4 years later than most assume, in 440 BC. That is the year the walls were completed, the year Jerusalem finally rose from the rubble it had been lying in since 586 BC. Nearly a century and a half of desolation finally ending. So here's our gap. From 538 BC to 440 BC, the period between the end of the first 7 weeks and the beginning of the next 62 weeks. It's 98 years. Now, I want you to notice something about that number. 98 years divided by 7. That's exactly 14 weeks of years. It's also a group of weeks of years. I'm not going to tell you that that proves anything on its own. It doesn't. But it is, and I think you'll agree, tantalizing. And as we continue through the rest of the prophecy, that number is going to come back around in a way that will matter. File it away for now. The 62 weeks begin in 440 BC. And what happens at the end of them is where this prophecy moves from fascinating to staggering. Step number 4. The 62 weeks of years ending at 6 BC. Gabriel continues. The second great period of the prophecy now begins. 62 weeks of years. 434 years. And Gabriel doesn't just give us the number. He gives us a description of what this period would look like. Right at the start of these 62 weeks, Jerusalem will be rebuilt, restored, functioning, inhabited. but it will happen through exceedingly difficult times. Now here's something worth noting. In almost every other treatment of this prophecy, that detail gets completely glossed over. It's a throwaway line to most interpreters. They're so focused on the numbers that they skip right past it. But it's not a throwaway. It's a fingerprint. Because if you actually know the history of Jerusalem between 440 BC and the turn of the millennium, that phrase, difficult times, is one of the most accurate descriptions you could possibly give it. From the moment Nehemiah completed those walls, there were enemies surrounding the city who wanted nothing more than to tear them back down. And repeatedly, over those 4 centuries, that's exactly what happened. The walls were breached, partially demolished, rebuilt. The city changed hands. Greeks, Ptolemies, Seleucids, Romans. Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple. The Maccabean revolt. Roman intervention under Pompey. And right at the very end of this period, Herod the Great undertook a massive reconstruction of the temple itself, one of the most ambitious building projects of the ancient world. Rebuilt, yes, but through exceedingly difficult times, exactly as Gabriel said. So now the math. Starting from 440 BC and moving forward 434 years, we arrive at 6 BC. And if you know your history, if you've been following the internal logic of this interpretation from the very beginning, you already know what happened in 6 BC. That is the year the second anointed one entered the timeline of human history. It was the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. Think about what Gabriel has done here. He's told Daniel in 538 BC, over 5 centuries before it happened, that at the end of this long period of rebuilding and difficulty, a second Messiah would appear. And at the end of exactly 434 years from the beginning of Jerusalem's restoration, a child was born in Bethlehem. That's not a loose approximation. That's not somewhere around that era. That is precise, verifiable, historically anchored fulfillment of a specific prophetic number. Now, I'm aware that 6 BC as the birth of Jesus is not the date most people have in their heads. There are several lines of evidence I could walk through to establish it. And if you want the full treatment, my previous videos go into a lot of that in depth. But let me give you one proof. It's a proof that most people have never heard of, and it's a remarkable one. It appears that up to around 1000 AD, the actual birth year of Jesus was still widely known and commonly understood. It was simply part of the shared knowledge of the civilizations of that era. Somewhere over the following centuries, that specific knowledge faded, lost in the accumulated confusion of competing calendars, political upheavals, and the gradual drift of historical memory. But it was recorded. A Muslim scholar named al-Biruni documented the beliefs of the various religions surrounding him at the time. And he noted that both Jews and Christians of his era considered the birth of Jesus to have occurred in Alexandrian year 304 of the Seleucid era. The Seleucid era calendar began in 310 BC. So year 304 of that system corresponds to 6 BC. That's the very year the math of this prophecy demands. That's not a Christian source protecting a theological position. That's an outside observer recording what was simply common knowledge at the time, and it confirms exactly where the 62 weeks of Gabriel's prophecy points. Step number 5. After the 62 weeks, there's another gap. Now watch what Gabriel does here, because he shifts his approach in a subtle but important way. Up to this point, he has followed a consistent pattern. He introduces a period of weeks, then describes what happens during that time. 7 weeks, here's what occurs. 62 weeks, here's what occurs. The structure has been orderly and sequential. But now he breaks that pattern. He states several significant details that are not attached to any period of weeks at all. They simply happen after the 62 weeks. They float, untethered, in an unspecified stretch of time. What are these details? There's 2 of them, and they're enormous. The second Messiah will be cut off, killed. And the city, Jerusalem, along with the sanctuary, the temple, will be completely and utterly destroyed, desolated. From hindsight, we know exactly what these refer to. Jesus died and was resurrected at the beginning of this period. And then, some years later, Jerusalem was sacked in its entirety. The population was killed or scattered to the surrounding nations. The temple was destroyed so completely that Jesus himself had foretold not one stone would be left upon another. And here is where we find ourselves today, still living in this gap. An unspecified number of years between the end of the 62 weeks and the final period Gabriel has yet to describe. An era whose length was never stated, because it wasn't given to Daniel to know. But Gabriel does tell Daniel one more thing. There is a final grouping, one last week of years, 7 years, that completes the full count of the 70 weeks. So let's look at the math of where we actually are. From 6 BC to 2025 AD is a period of 2030 years. And 2030 divided by 7 works out to exactly 290 weeks of years. Clean, no remainder. Yet another grouping of complete weeks of years. The pattern holding all the way to the present day. Now that raises the question, was 2025 the start of the final 7-year period? Here, I need to explain something important about how the chart tracks years, because this is where a lot of confusion can creep in if we're not careful. Our Western calendar is based on the Gregorian system, where the year begins in January. But the Jewish calendar operates differently. It actually has 2 distinct starting points that fall 6 months apart. The first is in September or October, and this is the start of the Jewish civil year, when the year number itself increments, Rosh Hashanah. The second is in March or April, the start of the religious year, with Passover being the first major festival of that cycle. When I constructed the chart, I made the decision to use Western years. Obviously, what my audience would be most familiar with, but this creates an overlap. A Jewish year that begins in the autumn will span 2 of our Gregorian years before it ends in the following autumn. Which means technically, every date on the chart could be labeled as 2 years. That would be messy and confusing, so I didn't do that. But in the case of 2025, this overlap matters, because what the chart is actually pointing to is a period that begins in the autumn of 2025 and runs through to the autumn of 2026. And it can be narrowed down considerably more than that. That narrowing, that precision, is the most extraordinary thing about this entire prophecy. And it is exactly what this video has been building towards. Step number 6, the final week, 2032 AD. At this point, you might be thinking, isn't 2025, 2026 just an arbitrary choice? Isn't this exactly what prophecy teachers always do, picking a date and building a case around it? That's a fair challenge, and I want to address it directly. Every person who has ever attempted to predict the future with any specificity has eventually been proven wrong. Every single one. And that's not lost on me. I'm aware of that track record, and I have no interest in joining that list. So my approach has been different. Rather than starting with a conclusion and working backward, I've examined the patterns that the past actually exhibits, verified, documented patterns, and then extrapolated forward to see if anything significant emerges. I let the patterns speak. I don't force them. And what I'm about to show you are two additional layers of evidence, both independent of the biblical timeline we already established, that anchor the final 7 years in a time with a specificity that I find remarkable. Both are technical, and I've covered them in depth in other videos. Here, I'll give you the essential picture. Eclipse event signs. This is something I discovered through my own research. I have not come across anyone else who has identified or described what I'm about to explain. And I want to be clear up front. This has nothing to do with the blood moon craze that swept through Christian prophecy circles some years back. That was what was based on a flawed methodology. This is different. Here's the foundation. The Jewish calendar is luni-solar, meaning it's tied to the lunar cycle but kept in alignment with the seasons. Because of how that calendar works, a solar eclipse can only occur at the very beginning of a Jewish month. And a lunar eclipse can only occur at the middle of a Jewish month. That's simply how the geometry works. The sun, moon, and earth have to be in precise alignment, and that alignment only happens at those specific points in the lunar cycle. Now, here's what's significant. The majority of Jewish festivals fall either at the beginning of the month or at the middle of the month, which means eclipses naturally tend to occur in proximity to Jewish festival dates. But what I noticed when I began working through NASA's historical eclipse tables was something beyond that general proximity. At certain specific moments in history, there were distinct groupings of lunar and solar eclipses, clusters, that fell right at Jewish festival dates. Not one eclipse near a festival, multiple eclipses in sequence, precisely aligned with the Jewish calendar. And when I started mapping those groupings against the historical record, something extraordinary emerged. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586, eclipse grouping. The decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 440 BC, eclipse grouping. The birth of Jesus in 6 BC, eclipse grouping. The death and resurrection of Christ Jesus in 31 AD, eclipse grouping. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, eclipse grouping. The rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948, eclipse grouping. The Six-Day War in 1967, and eclipse grouping. Every single one of those historically pivotal moments in Jewish history was accompanied by a cluster of eclipses falling on Jewish feast days. And I noticed something else. The more significant the event, the larger the grouping. A smaller event might have 2 solar eclipses. A major one might have a grouping of 7 solar or lunar eclipses combined. For 20 years, I have been waiting, specifically waiting, to see what 2024 and 2025 would hold. Because both of those years showed potential for eclipse groupings. But I couldn't know for certain in advance, because the precise alignment depends on the observational determination of the Jewish calendar, specifically the observation of the winter barley in Israel, which determines when the year actually begins. I'll explain that in just a moment. But what I can tell you now is 2024 turned out to have no eclipse event sign. But 2025 saw the beginning of a series of 2 solar eclipses coinciding with Jewish feast days. That was the first independent confirmation, arriving through a completely separate line of evidence from the biblical timeline, that 2025-2026 represents a significant moment in the life of the Jewish people. And then there was 2032. The next grouping of eclipse event signs falls in 2032, and it is unlike anything I have ever encountered in 20 years of this research. It contains the largest clustering of eclipses I have ever found, pointing to a year that may be one of the most significant in all of human history. And it's exactly 7 years after 2025. Next, the rediscovery of the proper observational-based Jewish calendar. Now here is the second discovery. And again, I've investigated whether anyone in modern times had known this before me, and it appears no one had. Though, once again, it was Al-Biruni who preserved traces of it in his writings around 1000 AD. And what I've been able to do that he didn't is prove it mathematically. So what is it? At the heart of the Jewish calendar is something called the Metonic cycle. This is a 19-year pattern that determines when an extra month gets added to keep the lunar calendar aligned with the seasons. You see, instead of adding an extra day every few years, the way our Gregorian calendar does, the Jewish calendar adds an entire extra month every second or third year. That's the Metonic cycle. And here's the critical question that nobody seemed to be asking. Since the cycle can skip either 2 or 3 years between editions, exactly which years should the extra month fall on? Which specific Metonic pattern is the correct one? My discovery is that the answer depends entirely on which calendar rule you're using to determine the new month or the new moon that begins each month. And there are 3 distinct rules in play. The modern Jewish calendar, the one used today, states that if the new moon occurs before the spring equinox, an additional month must be added. The Babylonian calendar, which is also a lunisolar calendar, states that the new year begins at the first new moon after the spring equinox. And the biblical calendar, the one actually in use during the time the scriptures were written, is a purely observational calendar. It looks at the ripeness of the winter barley in Israel in relation to the upcoming Passover and the Feast of First Fruits. The specific rule is this: if Aviv barley, that is barley with green ears, does not exist by the time the next new moon, then an additional month must be added. At the latitude of Jerusalem, this typically happens in the 3rd or 4th week of March. So each of these 3 calendar rules produce a Metonic cycle that begins in a different year. The cycles are offset from each other. The calendar stays in sync with the seasons either way, but which months the festivals fall in depends entirely on which Metonic cycle you're using. And this matters enormously because the modern Jewish calendar, introduced around 350 AD, centuries after Christ walked the earth, has caused the Jewish festivals to regularly occur in the wrong months ever since. Only the Metonic cycle, based on the actual life cycle of the winter barley, places the festivals where God specified that they should occur. Now, why does any of this matter for our purposes? Here is the point all of this technical discussion has been building towards. It is almost universally accepted among serious students of prophecy that Jesus fulfilled the spring festivals during his first coming, Passover, first fruits, Pentecost, and that he will fulfill the autumn festivals at his return, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles. So, if 2032 is a significant year, and the eclipse evidence strongly suggests this, then we should be looking carefully at the dates of the autumn festivals in that year. According to the modern Jewish calendar, those festivals fall in September of 2032. But let's look at the actual Hebrew year, 5792. Divide 5792 by 19, because 19 is the number of years in the Metonic cycle, and examine the remainder. The remainder is 16. And according to the proper biblical calendar Metonic pattern, a remainder of 16 means that a year requires an additional month. That pushes everything forward. Under the correct observational calendar, the autumn festivals of 5792 fall not in September, but in October. Wednesday, October 6th, is the beginning of the month. Thursday into Friday, October 14th evening into 15th, is the Day of Atonement. And Wednesday, October 20th, is the start of the Feast of Tabernacles. This is an extraordinarily important point. It is only when you use the proper Barley-based biblical calendar, not the modern Jewish calendar that has been used since 350 AD, that the festivals land where they should. And it is only then that the full precision of what this prophecy may be pointing to becomes visible. The numbers in Daniel 8 and 12. Now we go deeper still, because anchoring the final 7 years isn't just about the starting point. It's about what happens inside that period. In Daniel chapters 8 and 12, there are 4 very specific numbers mentioned. 2,300, 1,290, 1,335, and 3.5 years. They are all related to the temple, its eventual desecration and restoration. And the one that becomes immediately relevant here is the 2,300. It's listed as 2,300 evening and morning units. I go into considerable detail about what that means in a previous video, but briefly, it refers to the ongoing daily sacrifices which happen every morning and every evening in the temple. Pair them together and you get 1,150 actual days. The prophecy states that from the moment the temple sacrifices are stopped until the sanctuary is again restored, exactly 1,150 days will pass. Daniel 9 tells us that in the middle of the final 7-year period, at the 3.5-year mark, the temple will be desecrated and all temple activity will cease. That is when the 1,150-day begins. But here's the key. We know the end point. The Day of Atonement, October 15th, 2032. Count back those 1,150 days from that date, and the calendar math lands on August 21st and 22nd, 2029. In the Jewish calendar, that is Av the 10th. Now, if you know Jewish history, that date just stopped you cold. Because both the first temple and the second temple were destroyed on the very same date, the same day of the month, the same day of the week, thousands of years apart. Of the 10th is already one of the most sobering dates in all of Jewish history. And here it appears again at the midpoint of the final 7 years as the moment the third temple's sacrifices are cut off. It's not a coincidence I manufactured. That is what the math produces. And if we know the midpoint, if August 21st, 22nd, 2029 is the 3.5-year mark, then simple calendar math in the other direction gives us the starting point of the entire final week. That date is February 27th, 2026. I proposed that specific date in videos published 4 years ago. It is in my published book from 10 years ago, and it has been in my research notes since 2005. I'm writing and actually reading these words on March 5th, 2026. And it was on the evening of February 27th, 2026, as it turned to the 28th in Israel, that the United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated attack on Iran, taking out their leadership and striking numerous military targets. As of this moment, the conflict is ongoing. The date I calculated from a 2,500-year-old prophecy arrived exactly on time. But there's something else happening alongside this conflict that connects directly to what Gabriel describes in the final week of this prophecy. Reports have emerged showing that elements within both the US and Israeli military are actively looking towards this conflict as a path to rebuilding the third Jewish temple, or at the very least that this has a religious war overtone. Many Israeli forces have been photographed wearing badges bearing the image of the third temple. This is not a fringe sentiment. This is a serious and stated goal within significant military circles. And that is precisely what Gabriel predicted. Daniel 9 describes the final 70th week as being fundamentally about the establishment of a new temple and the restarting of the required sacrifices, a rekindling of the covenant relationship between God and his people Israel. We are not watching the stage being set for something that might happen someday. The curtain has already gone up. In conclusion, you are here, right at the start of the 70th week, the final 7 years before the return of Messiah Jesus to this earth in bodily form. We walked through it together, step by step. Biblical evidence, historical records, linguistic rules, cultural practices, mathematical relationships, eclipse patterns, calendar astronomy. And they all converged on the same point, reconstructing the accurate interpretation of the 70 weeks prophecy that Gabriel spoke to Daniel over 2,500 years ago. And not only were we able to determine a year or even a general season, we were able to arrive at a specific date, February 27th, 2026. Calculated from a 2,500-year-old prophecy, cross-referenced against NASA eclipse tables, confirmed by the life cycle of winter barley in Jerusalem, and anchored to the destruction dates of temples that stood thousands of years ago. History arrived exactly on time. Now, I want to be honest with you, as I always have been. Whether or not these events unfold exactly as this timeline describes, the fact remains that according to every line of evidence available, every methodology I know how to apply, every historical and astronomical confirmation I've been able to find, We are entering a period that the Bible has an enormous amount to say about. The 70th week is not a theological abstraction. It is, if this interpretation is correct, the final chapter of a story that has been unfolding for millennia. As always, check the evidence for yourself. Don't take my word for it. The sources are all provided in the more detailed videos, and I'd encourage you to watch those if anything here has raised questions you want answered more fully. Thank you for spending this time with me as I share what I can only describe as the most earth-shattering information I have ever encountered. 20 years ago, it blew my mind. Today, watching it unfold in real time, I find myself without adequate words. You are here. We are here, together. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus.